I don't know how many for sure you've written, but I know of 9 that I wanted you to say a word about. So I'll mention the books, and then you can just say a word about them, whatever you would kind of the way you would describe them to people. And I would encourage everyone. My favorite and the one that I've used for years is the Quotable Lewis. You want to say a word about that one?
Yeah, a publisher at Tyndale House came to me and said, we don't have a book on C.S. Lewis, and it's a major omission, and we think you should put one together for us. And so he said, do you have any ideas? I said, yeah, every week I get 2 or 3 people calling me up, asking me, where can I find this in Lewis, or where can I find that? And I described the book as it came out to him at that time. And he said, we want to do that book. That's the one we want. And I said, it's too much work for one person. So Wayne Martindale, it was after a worship service at our church, Wayne Martindale was standing across the narthex. I said, Wayne teaches courses on Lewis too. Maybe he'd be willing to do it. And so we went over and talked to Wayne. Wayne said, I like the idea. And 2 weeks later, we signed the contract. But 4 years later, the book came out because we went through everything Lewis published. And that book represents everything Lewis published except one thing. And that was the introduction to his wife's Smoke on the Mountain, the book she wrote on the 10 Commandments. And it was Westminster Press, and they wouldn't give us permission to quote from it.
Oh man.
So we missed out on 3 quotes from that particular essay. But other than that, it's probably the best-selling, it's hands down the best-selling book I ever did. But you notice I didn't write it with a pen, I wrote it with scissors. It's all cut and paste.
And then
A lot of work though. I worked on it from 4 in the morning till 8 in the morning for 4 years.
Oh my goodness. Wow. And then C.S. Lewis and a Problem of Evil.
That was a more popular edition of what my dissertation was, my doctoral dissertation.
Okay.
And it's guaranteed to cure insomniacs, that book. And it's very academic, but I think it's a good book by virtue of its depth of Lewis and its explanation of Lewis. But there you go.
And then Splendor in the Dark, C.S. Lewis's Dimer in his life and work.
The longest narrative poem Lewis ever wrote was called Dimer. Came out in 1926. He had sort of hung his reputation on becoming a narrative poet, but by the time T.S. Eliot came on the scene, nobody was reading narrative poetry anymore. But this book, I think, even though it came out 5 years before Lewis's conversion, I think it's very important because I think so much of what we see developing in Lewis, we can find in seed in that book. It will only bear fruit after he comes to faith. But I do think it's an important book. So I was trying to bring people's attention to it. Most people never read that book. Yeah. But and the other thing, they published, the Lewis estate allowed Lewis's Dimer to be published in that book. Oh, so wow. It's the first time I can then say I published a book with C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. That's great. And then The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis.
Well, I was studying Lewis, as I have been for 51 years and teaching him for 41 years. As I was studying him, I noticed that he used the word imagination or described imagination 31 different ways. And so I thought, man, it's like they say, indigenous people who live in the North, they have 30 different words for snow because they live in it 24/7. Lewis, who trafficked in the imagination, nuanced the concept of the imagination very precisely. So we took that book. Mark Neal is a guy who's a real close friend of mine. He had published on Lewis, but he had never done a book on it yet. So I said, Mark, you do this book with me. It'll be good for you and it'll get you published. And so we looked at 15 of the different ways Lewis used imagination and then used books where that view of the imagination, that approach to imagination is embodied in the book itself. And then in the appendix, we list the other uses of the imagination.
Good.
You can't grow in your thinking without use of the imagination. Even the scientist begins his method or her method with a hypothesis, which is an imaginative depiction. And then when they find something, they try and explain it with models. The models are not the thing itself, they're imaginative depictions. All growth of knowledge is predicated on the use of the imagination.
And then The Soul of C.S. Lewis, A Meditative Journey Through 26 of his best loved writings.
Yeah, we took different books, and again, there were. I did a book for this group that was acquiring books for publication on Lewis, and we did all the work, and then they didn't publish it after we had done the work. And so I said they wanted me to edit it, and I said, well, what will I pay people who contribute? And they told me, so I went and told the people this is what we could pay you, and then they backed out after the people had already done the writing. So I couldn't understand it. So I said, what do I do with the people who did the writing? They say, you don't have a contract with us. So I paid them all out of pocket, except the ones that had published before, because they were used to sometimes goofy things happening with publishers. It wasn't the publisher who actually did it, who did this. It was the acquisition group that went after the book for the publisher. So anyway, this book then, they came to me guilty and said, could you do this one? And I did 3/5 of that book. And then there were others who contributed to it. But if we look at different books of Lewis's, we look at key ideas in the books, and then we have a page of explanation of what's going on with that key concept.
Yeah. And then the neglected C.S. Lewis, exploring the riches of his most overlooked books.
Most of Lewis's best books are his literary critical books, and nobody ever reads them. So again, Mark Neal, who I did the Imagination book with, I said to Mark, we need to do another book on Lewis. So what we did, we put together a bunch of essays that we read at lectures that we read at the Wade Center, the largest collection of Lewis material in the world. It's here at Wheaton College. And then we said, okay, let's produce this and make a book out of this. So there are books like English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. To write that book, Lewis read every book written in English in the 16th century. He read it in the original, if it was written in another language, whether it be Old French or Italian or Latin. And then he read it in translation too, so that his comments on it could be fair-minded and so on. And then another one be The Allegory of Love, which was a book that established his literary critical reputation at Oxford University. It came out in 1936. And Norman Cantor, who wrote a book called Reimagining the Middle Ages, he was a medieval scholar who taught at Columbia University. He said, sometimes authors will write a book and nobody reviews it. It's a kiss of death. Sometimes somebody will write a book and they may give it a negative review. That's better than no review, because at least you weren't ignored. A good review is even better. And he says, but very, very seldom does somebody write a book and it changes the way people approach that genre. And The Allegory of Love is a book like that, Cantor said. And then the other one, there's another one called The Preface to it's called The Personal Heresy. And it's a debate that Lewis had with the Master of Jesus College, Cambridge, on something that the Master of Jesus College, E.M.W. Tilliard, had written about Milton. And Lewis took issue with him. And the debate started in a literary journal, and it went on for about 3 years. And then they both said, let's write a book on this. And it is a masterful example of how to engage and debate without rancor, without ad hominems, without informal fallacies of varying sorts. And it is a debate that produces light and not heat. And I think it's something everybody should read just to learn how to do this well in our goofy day. But there's a whole bunch of other books in there that I think are extremely significant. And again, nobody reads them. The Discarded Image, Lewis's book on the medieval worldview. There were lectures he gave at Oxford for 29 years. And he would give them every 3 years, these lectures, and always adding to them and developing them. And then there's another one, The Arthurian Torso, his literary critical work of Charles Williams, a close friend of his, one of the Inklings, his work on the Arthurian legends. And it's a brilliant book in literary criticism, a good example of how to do it. And just, they're fabulous books, but nobody ever reads them. So we think, well, if they neglect those, if they're neglected Lewis books, if we write a book about them, it'll guarantee our book will be neglected too.
And then the final one on Lewis is the misquotable C.S. Lewis, what he didn't say, what he actually said, and why it matters.
Well, actually, I didn't write that. I gave a lecture on some things that are attributed to Lewis that aren't true. And a guy heard it and he said, could we do a book on things that people quote, where they quote Lewis and Lewis didn't say them? I said, I don't have time for it. Why don't you do it? But I wrote the introduction to that book. So that's not a book I actually wrote.
Okay. And then And then there are two others that are not related to Lewis, but I think are great books. Naked and Ashamed, A Guide to the Necessary Work of Christian Marriage.
Well, actually, it's Naked and Unashamed.
What did I say?
Naked
Naked
and
and Ashamed. I meant Naked and Unashamed.
so in marriage, it's a book on premarital counseling. So I've done over 900 weddings. I mean, Kenny, you and I have done some weddings together.
Yeah.
So, but I've officiated at over 900 weddings. I lost track years ago, and I've done premarital counseling with maybe another 600 couples whose weddings I didn't do. So that's over 3,000 people, and so we decided we'd take the material that we used and put it together as a book so it would be available for other people if they wanted it. But the idea of naked and unashamed, God has said we get naked in marriage after we're married, not before. And a lot of people, they end up finding the easiest form of intimacy is physical intimacy. And it's so powerful that they end up never really getting intimate before they marry in all these other areas where we can legitimately undress. So they end up marrying a body they know well, but not a person they know at all. So this talks about how to undress spiritually, psychologically, intellectually, historically, how to learn to undress in communication with honest communication and so on, how to undress financially to get on the same page on your economics. And then we have a section at the end on physical intimacy.
Good. And then one that you've spoken on about at Emmanuel, the sacrament of evangelism.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think we take anybody we don't take Jesus to anybody. He's already there. And people who embrace sacramental theology say the sacraments, God is present and he's mediating grace. Well, I think in evangelism, God is present and he's mediating grace. So we go to make explicit what he might already be doing in that person's life. But that means we need to listen. We need to ask questions that are appropriate, that draw the person out. And where we begin to see where something spiritual is already percolating in them, then we begin to speak to that issue in their heart as we point them to Jesus. That book, Sacrament of Evangelism, is actually a course I teach at Wheaton College that I've turned into a book. The other guy, Stan Guthrie, who did it with me, I wrote about 85% of that book. He wrote about 15, but he's quite a writer. And so he used to work with Christianity Today. So he did the orthography, which means corrected the spelling and the grammar.
Good. Well, Jerry, I'll say this to everybody. If we had a book table, we'd have all those books out there. But I hope that all of you will go to Amazon and look them up and maybe order one of Jerry's books that you would like him to maybe autograph when he comes next time, which we don't know when that'll be, but hopefully it'll be sooner than later when he comes.
That's the C.S. Lewis Bible. That's another one I edited.
Oh, that's right. C.S. Lewis Bible.
Yeah.
And say a word about that.
Well, I got contacted by Harper and Row, and they had an edition of the Bible, and they said, could you pull together a team that you could cull through Lewis's writing and then find writings that will accord with some passage of scripture, and then lace the book with a sort of a Lewisian commentary on those texts. So I pulled together a group, and most of them didn't do anything. So I probably did 90% of that book. And then I wrote the introduction, and I wrote another thing on how to use the book. And then Doug Grisham, C.S. Lewis's son, stepson, also participated with us on that. So he and I did that.
Good. And any others I'm missing?
No, I'm working on 3 others right now, one on Job and one on hell. So I'm living in a complete downer.
One on Job and one on hell.
And then there's a novel I'm working on, and then I'm hoping I'm going to retire at the end of June. I'm hoping to turn this Lewis course that I've been teaching in one configurement or another for 41 years. I'm hoping to turn that into a book.
Yeah.
And then when that's done, I'm hoping to go home to heaven.
Well, Jerry, you know what? I'll let you take it away. If we were here again together, you'd hear us. I'd say, let us welcome Jerry, and everybody would give a big round of applause. So I'll turn it over to you and give us some good teaching on the abolition of man.
Okay, thank you very much for letting me be with you again. You know, they say if you go in for your first knee surgery, that's one thing, but when you're willing to go in for a second one, you already know the pain that's coming up. So now that you've had me here for three 3 lectures. I feel bad for you people, but nevertheless, thank you for letting me come. And I enjoy talking about Lewis, not because I want you to focus on Lewis, but because he opens more than wardrobe doors for us. And you'll see, even as we look at the abolition of man and then try to apply it at the end, how in fact it will open up all kinds of thinking for you when it comes to issues of beauty and judgments about beauty, judgments about morality and why we should live the way we should live, and so on. But I want to begin first with a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank you for these kind people who have allowed me to come and share with them. And I pray, Father, that each one who is gathered here this evening would receive something that they would believe was specifically meant for them to hear. Again, your son once took 5 loaves and 2 fish, just crumbs for the amount of people who were hungry. And he blessed them and he broke them and he multiplied them and everybody left satisfied. I pray, asking that your Holy Spirit would do something like that for us this evening, that he would take the words that are given, these crumbs of one man, and somehow he would multiply them and bless them, break them and distribute them. So again, each person would hear something that would benefit him or her. And I pray it would be something that would cause us to be more in awe of you, to be more in a sense of wonder about the world where you've placed us, to give us confidence in the sure words that we could have in knowing you, and also humility in knowing that we never get a last word. There's always more. We could go deeper, we could go wider with the things we understand about you, but there will always be mysteries, things beyond our grasp. And it fills us, Lord, with a sense of wonder and awe. I pray that would be true this evening too. Also, Father, there are so many things in our culture that are so challenging to us. And the abolition of man gives us a skeletal structure even to understand those things. I pray, Father, that people would see the immediate application of that. And we ask this all in Jesus' name and for his glory. Amen. For several years, Kenny and I actually taught this book at College of DuPage in the philosophy department there. And it's probably the book by C.S. Lewis that I know the best, because I lost track of reading it about 60 times. So I know it fairly well. And my problem will be to make sure I can keep it down to a skeletal structure for your benefit and not go off into all the little nuances. But we'll do our best. God help us. Okay. The occasion for the book, C.S. Lewis had been sent a book to review. He refers to it as the Green Book, and he calls the authors Gaius and Titius. Now, if Lewis reviewed a book and it got a good review, that might bump up your sales, not as much as if Oprah reviews a book of yours or something like that, but nevertheless, it would help. And Lewis had just written an article about something that concerned him called subjectivism. And I'll talk more about that in a moment, but the essay, the article he wrote was called The Poison of Subjectivism. It appears in Christian Reflections, and Lewis is concerned when he sees people becoming not subjective. All of us are subjective. You look at the sentence, and the I in a sentence is the subject of the sentence. Then you have the object. I threw the ball to George. George is the object, and ball is the indirect object. I'm throwing the ball to George, or the ball might be the object and George might be the indirect object. But there's a subject and an object in the sentence. So too, there's an objective reality that exists independent of what we think about it. And there are our impressions, our subjective understanding of those things. And both of those things should be operational in any approach to truth. But with subjectivism, Lewis felt that people were neglecting the object, as a matter of fact, discounting it altogether, and became totally oriented, self-referential, and therefore projective on reality, making it what they want it to be. And Lewis is concerned about this. And so his objectivist commitments, which we talked about, I think, when we did our first lecture on Lewis's big ideas, and a little bit even on mere Christianity. Lewis's objectivist commitments: truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality, when I think accurately about it. Reality exists independent of my thoughts. And consequently, if I want to approach truth, my thoughts have to correspond to the reality that exists. And I'll never get to the bottom of what's out there, but I can still have a sure word. And the word that I know, the truth that I know, I can still go plumb it more deeply, apply it more widely, even to questions I haven't yet begun to ask. And I can understand it in relationship or in coherent relationship with other truths I already know. Those are the things that are driving Lewis when he writes this book. Mortimer Adler, who was a philosopher at University of Chicago, he was the editor-in-chief of the last edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. He put together the great books of the Western world. Many people know him for probably his most famous book, which is How to Read a Book. Mortimer Adler in 1967 included The Abolition of Man in the great books of the Western world. That means he ranked it up there with things like Plato's Apology or Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Poetics or Aristotle's Rhetoric or Aristotle's Metaphysics. He put it up there with Homer. He put it up there with Thomas Aquinas, with Augustine. He put it up there with Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton and Locke. And it was highly regarded, this book. Matter of fact, there were people who reacted to it too. The behaviorist, B.F. Skinner, he took issue with it because he was not an objectivist at all. And consequently, Lewis uses in the 3rd chapter a description of what he calls conditioners. And actually, B.F. Skinner took the term conditioner that he uses in Beyond Freedom and Dignity from Lewis's Abolition of Man. Matter of fact, 2 chapters in Beyond Freedom and Dignity, Skinner talks about the abolition of man. So it was an impactful book in many ways. And if we read it and we start to dig into what it says, I think it becomes a good skeletal structure for thinking about anything. But first off, the Green Book. The Green Book was really titled The Control of Language, and it was by 2 authors, Alec King and Martin Ketley. It was a book on language, language and grammar, written for 6th form students in England. 6th form would be the equivalent of our 11th and 12th grade year in high school. And then there's another book he refers to, the book by Orbilius. Huh? Somebody say something? Anyway, the other book is a book by Orbilius, and it was actually called The Reading and Writing of English by E.G. Biagini. And that book came out in 1936, and The Control of Language, the Green Book, came out in 1940. Now think where Europe was at the time those books came out. Already you had the threat of Nazism on the continent, and by 1940, England was already at war. And so this will be significant, and it'll come up later in the book itself. Well, the presuppositions of the book are, if you don't respond to objectivity, if you just have the subject all by themselves, in some senses, people will respond and what they think one way or another. It's pretty much by chance. Lewis writes pretty early in the book, he says, by the logic of their position, the position of a Gaius and Titius, they must just take their impulses just as they come from chance. They don't have any principle that's guiding them, and certainly not a principle rooted in reality, tethered to reality, and so forth. Well, what does he mean by chance? And what do materialists mean by chance when they say things just happen by chance? And some people might say, well, maybe they mean something like gambling. You know, life is just a crapshoot or something like that. But that's not what these people mean by chance. And it's not what Lewis meant when he accused them of just taking the world by chance. They're self-referential, they're subjectivists, and so on. And consequently, gambling itself is not pure chance. The laws of probability govern such things. It was Blaise Pascal, the French physicist and philosopher, who came up with the laws of probability because he had a friend who was losing his fortune in Paris in the 1600s. And so Pascal said, there's a way to look at this mathematically. And he develops the laws of probability. He actually uses it to set forth what is known as Pascal's wager. It's not a proof for God's existence, but it's a proof for why it's not good to be apathetic about making a decision whether or not you're going to follow God. Basically, the wager is, if I believe and I am right, when I die, I gain everything. If I believe and I am wrong, when I die, I lose everything. If I believe and I'm wrong, I lose nothing. If I believe, if I disbelieve and I'm right, I gain nothing. So I have everything to gain for belief and nothing to lose. But Pascal used that, but his real reason for it was working through the laws of probability to save his friend's fortune. And when we think about gambling, we're recognizing that there are odds that are at play. And if you go to a casino or something like that, those casinos didn't get built because the casino owners were at total risk. No, they're playing the odds completely to their favor. I remember going once to Monte Carlo. Actually, we were visiting Kenny and Kathy in France, and then we went down to Monte Carlo during that time, and we went into that opulent casino there. Didn't get built because the casino owners were working with just utter randomness. No, they were playing the laws of probability. And it was interesting. You could go into the casino and you would see a sign that says French wheels to the left in roulette, or French games to the left, American games to the right. So an American goes in and says, I'm going to go play the American games. But actually, the American games are set up so that the odds are greater against the gambler than the European wheels. So let's look at the roulette wheel for just a second. I know you thought you were going to hear about C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to tell you about about roulette. The French wheel has 37 wedges, and they're colored black and white, every other one except one wedge. The 37th is colored green. It has a number 0 on it. All the others are numbered odd or even. And consequently, the house edge on a 50-50 bet, because of that green wedge, is always a 2.7 advantage to the house. There are no 50-50 bets. It's a 52.7 to a 47.3. And the payout, if you bet 50-50, you don't get a pure 50-50 payout because of this odds being against you. But the American wheel has 38 spaces, 2 green wedges, and 36 others, black and red, and odd or even in their numbers. So that means the house edge is 5.3%, and there are no 50-50 bets. It's a 55.3 to 44.7. So if you want to lose your money faster, first off, you shouldn't gamble at all. But if you want to lose your money faster, play the American wheels. There's no randomness to gambling. It's all based on odds. Were the odds not stacked again in the casino's favor, there would be no opulent casinos. When we talk about randomness, when we talk about chance, what do we really mean by that? And it means something like this. Drop the ball into the wheel and it falls into space 12 even or 12 red. The next time you drop the ball into the wheel, it lands in Chicago. The next time you drop the ball into the wheel, it becomes a Chevy under the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. The next time you drop the ball and the wheel goes through the earth and ends up as a tamarisk tree in Borneo. The next time you drop the ball, it explodes in midair. The next time you drop the ball, it flies out into outer space. It grows massive in size and becomes a second moon orbiting the earth. That is what we mean by random. And if you begin with a random approach to knowledge or to truth or to morality or anything like that, what inference can you develop beginning with that presupposition? Well, if you begin by chance, there can be no direction. Chance in the way I've just described it, that randomness. If you begin by chance, there can be no direction. If there is no direction, then there are no goals. It's not moving towards any particular end. If there's no goals, there are no purposes. And if there's no purpose, there's no meaning. But if you go back to the other possibility, that which is by cause, then there can be direction. And if there's direction, there can be goals or ends. It could be moving towards a particular thing. Or there could be purpose, or there could be meaning. If we look at the universe, it's like a job description. Which philosophical view does it best support? And I think about this sometimes. Creation itself implies intention. Or Dante in the De Monarchia, a book Lewis quotes in one of the neglected C.S. Lewis books, in that one, The Arthurian Torso. He's quoting from the De Monarchia in Dante, and Dante says function precedes essence. Function, purpose, precedes essence, the gifts and abilities he gave me to fulfill the function. God had a purpose for you before he ever made you. And then he worked into that, giving you the things that you needed to fulfill that purpose. There was never a time where you were a new thought in God's mind. He always knew you were going to be here. He always had a purpose for you. And in creation, creation implies intention. When he allowed you to be made and born in this world, he was already setting a trajectory for your life. That's a cause origin. It's meaningful, it's purposeful, it's significant. So anyway, Lewis says, by the logic of the authors Gaius and Titius, by the logic of their position, they must just take their impulses, they come from chance. And consequently, the morality is self-referential. If it's self-referential, it can become easily tyrannical, certainly anarchistic, but possibly tyrannical if I can get together a party, and it can become controlling. The self-referential generally move towards utility. So it also means no cause, no ethics, morality dies, man dies, thus the abolition of man. You can see this a little bit in the Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. He kind of plays with this idea that Lewis is writing about here. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his essay Existentialism, made this observation. Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, if there is no cause, then there is no morality. Everything is permissible. Well, if you go to the Brothers Karamazov and you see how Dostoevsky treats the subject, he treats it very differently than Sartre did. Sartre basically says, and that's my contention, there is no God, so there is no morality. You can do whatever you want. But Dostoevsky, in his book Brothers Karamazov, shows the bankruptcy of that particular view. If you've read the book, or if you haven't, I'll just rehearse real quick what goes on in that book, because it echoes some of the themes in The Abolition of Man. Fyodor Dostoevsky is a despicable person. He has his sons, and he ill-treats them. His oldest son, Dmitri, who also goes by the name Mitya, you know, with a Russian novel, you don't know what the nicknames are, right? If you read a book about William and then he's called Bill, we get that. If you read a book about Robert and then he's called Bob, we get that. Or Charlie and he's called, or Charles and he's called Chuck or Charlie, we get that. Russian novels, you know, you got to keep a glossary going so you don't confuse the characters. But Dmitri or Mitya is in conflict with his father. The father's despicable. Dmitri feels like he has a right to some of the inheritance. They argue a lot. Not only that, there's a woman of questionable character named Grushenka, and Fyodor Dostoevsky, who's a womanizer, has kind of the hots for her. But also, interestingly enough, Dmitri has the hots for her as well. And so there's a lot of reasons for conflict, and we'll come to that in just a moment. The second son's name is Ivan, and Ivan is a prototypical Bolshevik. This is before the Bolshevik Revolution, but only about 40 years probably before. And he has all these Bolshevik sentiments, and it's Ivan who's the character who says, if there is no God, there is no meaning, everything is permissible. And so and Ivan is in conflict with his father. Ivan's also in conflict with Dmitri, because Dmitri is betrothed to Katrina, but Ivan has the hots for Katrina. Who says the soap operas have all the intrigue? I mean, here it is, this novel, this 19th century novel. Well, there's another son, and his name is Alyosha. His nickname is Alexei. And Alexei recognizes the Karamazov struggles, the DNA, the sensualism that's at risk in this family, the kind of greed, the self-referentialism and so on. But Alyosha wants to follow God. And he falls under the tutelage of a monk named Zosima. And he believes that Zosima will become a saint. And it was believed that if a person died, and Zosima is an Orthodox priest, if a sweet smell comes from him after he dies, then he should be made into a saint. And no sweet smell is coming from him. And Alyosha has really committed himself to God and feels that Zosima is the right guy. He's his disciple and so on. And he's having a crisis of faith. It's at that time that Grushenka hears about it. And Grushenka thinks that all men are bad. She knows how to work men to her advantage. Everybody's trying to work somebody to their advantage in that book. And so she says she wants to see Alyosha and she wants to compromise him because nobody can be as good as he is. And he hears this and hears that she wants to see him, and he doesn't want to go because he's afraid if he does, he'll stumble. And then he thinks, but if I can't stand up against this, then maybe my faith isn't real. Maybe it's just a house of cards. So he goes. And even though he's having a crisis of faith about Zosima's death, he goes to see Grushenka and he sees good in her. Nobody's seen good in her before. And she's off her guard by that. She hasn't had a man treat her respectfully before. So she distances herself from any designs she has for Alyosha and treats him as a father confessor. And there's a wonderful, wonderful story within the book where she talks about she had a dream of an old man who never did anything nice to anybody except, an old woman who never did anything nice to anybody except give an old man an onion one time. And the woman dies and goes to hell. And while she's burning in hell, all of a sudden she sees an angel ascending into hell, holding out an onion to her. Her one good act possibly could lead to her escape from hell. So she grabs onto the onion and the angel starts to pull her out of hell. And then somebody sees her going out of hell, grabs her leg. And then somebody else sees that person and grabs that person's leg and that person's leg and that person's leg. Whole train of people being pulled out of hell by this woman holding on to the onion as the angel pulls them out. And all of a sudden the woman looks at the onion and is fearful, looks down at all the people, and she looks down at them and she yells, "Let go!" And the angel lets go. They all go back down into hell. So Grushenka tells this story to Alyosha. Well, it ends up Dmitri and Fyodor Dostoevsky have a major, major fight. Oh, there's another son I forgot to tell you about, Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov is the illegitimate son of Karamazov. It's never stated explicitly, but the implications are everywhere. There was a village idiot. Her name was Lizaveta. She couldn't speak. And all of a sudden she becomes pregnant in the village. Everybody knows she's been raped. Everybody's pretty sure that Fyodor Karamazov has raped her. And just before she delivers her baby, she climbs over the Karamazov compound and she dies in childbirth. And Karamazov raises the child, but raises him as like a serf or a slave in his home. Well, anyway, there's a big fight that takes place between the father and his oldest son, Dmitri. Everybody hears it. And they all see Dmitri leave the house in a huff. And the next morning, the father, Fyodor Karamazov, is dead. All the evidence points to Dmitri, all of it. Well, Ivan, who lives in another city, he gets word of what's happened. And it's not long after that that Smerdyakov comes to see him. And Smerdyakov says to Ivan, "Well, I did it." And Ivan says, "Did what?" Smerdyakov says, "You said if there is no God, there is no morality and everything is permissible. So therefore, it didn't make any difference that there is no God. I killed Fyodor Karamazov." And all of a sudden, Ivan has to see the bankruptcy of his own philosophy. He basically goes mad. And Smerdyakov, when he finds out that Ivan did not tell the truth and now he's a murderer, he goes and hangs himself. And Alyosha goes to be with Dmitri when they don't know the evidence that it was really Smerdyakov. And consequently, Alyosha tries to find redemption in suffering, and also tries to find that in suffering can come some sort of good. But that novel is Sartre appealed to it. Dostoevsky had said, if there is no God, everything is permissible. And Dostoevsky is showing the bankruptcy of that. So too with Lewis in The Abolition of Man. If everything's by chance, there is no meaning, there is no value, and you can do whatever you want to. Self-referential and so on, subjectivistic, not in any way attending to the objective reality. The simple outline of the book of Abolition of Man, chapter 1, Lewis is showing reality exists independent of my thoughts about it. What I think is true when it corresponds to what I think is true when it corresponds to reality. This is the basis of objective values. And he calls this doctrine of objective value the Tao. He uses an Eastern term because he also wants to show that the concept of objectivity is not a mere Western thought. It transcends Western thinking. It is rooted in the reality that you can see demonstrated in the literature of all cultures. And Lewis tries to show that also in the appendix of The Abolition of Man, where he gives quotes from Eastern, Western, ancient, relatively modern literature that shows people are attentive to this. Chapter 2, those who deny objective values substitute arbitrary values in place of objectivity. And their arbitrary values are drawn from things like utility, instinct, or economics. And Lewis will explore each of these. And then chapter 3, when objective value dies, man dies. The will to power becomes the important thing, and tyranny follows. And Lewis is warning about these kinds of things. Things not unlike what we've been seeing on the streets of America for the last couple of years. The argument of the book, set forth by chapters and illustrated, goes something like this. You can see your notes. Chapter 1, he begins with a story. And in the Green Book, the authors, Gaius and Titius, have told a story of Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Rime of the Ancient Mariner, is a great literary critic. He wrote he was on a vacation, Coleridge, with William Wordsworth and William Wordsworth's sister, Dorothy Wordsworth. Lewis doesn't refer to where the story originates. It took me 15 years to find it, but it was from Dorothy Wordsworth's Grassmere Journals, 1803. And they were visiting the Coralline waterfall on the River Clyde. I went there, I wanted to see what it looked like. It's kind of this cascading waterfall. But anyway, they're at the waterfall. And Coleridge is looking at it and he's in awe of it. It's a beautiful waterfall. But as he's looking at it, there are two tourists there. And one of the tourists said the waterfall was pretty. The other one said it was sublime. In other words, it is the Platonic ideal of what waterfallness should be. And Coleridge agrees mentally with the tourist who says it's sublime. And he's somewhat dismissive with the tourist who says it's pretty. It's not that the tourist who said it was pretty didn't believe that there was something noteworthy about it. His vocabulary wasn't robust enough to describe it well. So anyway, Gaius and Titius say, basically, Coleridge had no right to make that judgment because the two were not saying anything about the waterfall per se, but only their own feelings about the waterfall. And consequently, their feelings didn't have any kind of rootedness to the thing that the waterfall was itself. So imagine with me for a second that you've got a waterfall here. Imagine on the shore, you've got Coleridge and the other tourists, and they're talking. And the one says it's pretty and the other says it's sublime. And Gaius and Titius basically draw a line between waterfall and tourists, saying this has nothing to do with the kinds of things they're saying. And these kinds of things they're saying are emotional, somewhat sentimental, and therefore have no rootedness in reality. Maybe they could say, okay, if you do a math problem and you're using your reason, if you're not getting the sum that you should get here, maybe there's a connection with reason, but certainly not with sentiments, not with emotion, and so on. And Gaius and Titius comment as follow. When the man said this is sublime, he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, they say, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. And they add, this confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually we're only saying something about our own feelings. Subjectivism is born. Lewis writes, the schoolboy who reads this passage in the Green Book will believe two propositions. Firstly, that all sentences containing a predicate of value are statements about the emotional state of the speaker. And secondly, that all such statements are unimportant. At that moment, objectivity is lost. The subjective and emotional dissolves and has nothing to validate its feelings. That which can sustain any kind of value judgment evaporates into mere subjectivism. And again, subjectivism does not deny subjectivity. It denies the importance of the objective reality that gives validation to the subjective judgments. I can give you an example. I went to Whittier College in Southern California, and it was a college where Nixon attended. Johnson was president, and Nixon's elected president my freshman year. As a result of that, everybody was at Whittier. All the protests during the Vietnam War, there was always evidences of it at Whittier. Back then, there were only three major news networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. They were on campus every week for some protest, some sit-in, something like that. It was kind of a wild time. And if a person was in the news, the next week they were on our free speech platform. Daniel Ellsberg, who stole the Pentagon Papers, he was there the week after that happened. Jane Fonda, the week she comes back from Hanoi, she's speaking on our free speech platform. Whenever I'd tell this story about her, I would never mention her in the past, but I read her autobiography and I read the part where she said she became a Christian, and I read what she said, and it sounded really good to me, and I think she's my sister in Christ. She apologized for what she had done when she had encouraged the Viet Cong to continue the fight against the Americans, and stood outside the Hanoi Hilton when she said these things. It was egregious. It was a foolish statements of a relatively young woman. And she's since grown out of that, but she actually came to faith. I think she's got some crazy ideas still, but who doesn't? And nevertheless, she was a person of faith. But she got up that day on the free speech platform, and she told us to all write to our friends that being in Vietnam, killing for peace was wrong. So write to our friends and tell them to frag their officers, our friends who were there. Now, fragging is when you would kill your officer, throw a hand grenade, put a hand grenade in their tent at night when they were sleeping, or shoot them in the back when they were in the battlefield stuff, so they couldn't really trace how this person died. And if we kill all the officers, we'll have to come home. So she's saying it's wrong to be in Vietnam killing for peace. So now write to your friends and tell them to kill for peace. And I'm going ballistic. I'm hearing this. I'm going, what on earth is she saying? I go to philosophy class after she gave her speech, and I'm livid, and I'm pacing back and forth. There was one of those tiered classrooms. I'm pacing back and forth. And I'm saying, there's only one guy in the class. He was there a little bit early too. I'm saying, what was she saying? What was she doing? This is ridiculous. And as I go on saying this is terrible what she said, this guy sitting in the classroom looks at me and says, well, that's a value judgment. Back then on the college campus, the cardinal sin was to commit a value judgment. And I go, oh yeah, I guess that was a value judgment. And I sat down feeling kind of bad about myself. And then I looked at that guy and said, yeah, but when you said that was a value judgment, that was a value judgment too. How come you can make it, but I can't make it? And how do we know if a value judgment has legitimacy or not? And the only way you're going to know is if you can get the objective reality. And so here's the deal. Gaius and Titius say Coleridge had no right to make that judgment. And yet they're making a judgment. What's the basis for their judgment? And if they've severed themselves from reality, they have no basis to undergird anything that would authenticate their judgment. And Lewis sees this, and he sees the incongruity. And yet, Gaius and Titius are still writing a book to try and give a point of view to the students. Lewis is engaged, in a sense, in deconstructing the Green Book. He's doing deconstructing before the postmodernists ever made it popular. He's trying to find the embedded assumptions in that book. And so Lewis goes on to say, the very power of Gaius and Titius depends on the fact that they're dealing with a boy who thinks he's doing his English prep and has no notion that ethics, theology, and politics are all at stake. Lewis goes on to say, I have hitherto been assuming that such teachers as Gaius and Titius do not fully realize what they're doing and do not intend the far-reaching consequences it will actually have. There is, of course, another possibility. What I have called, presuming on their concurrence in a certain traditional system of values, the trousered ape and the urban blockhead may be precisely the kind of man they really wish to produce. The differences between us may go all the way down. Get the popular opinion to move away from objective reality, and you are easily swayed then by the loudest voice. But they may, he said, really hold that the ordinary human feelings about the past or animals or large waterfalls are contrary to reason and contemptible and ought to be eradicated. There's no room for sentiment in their world. They may be intending to make a clean sweep of traditional values and start with a new set. That position will be discussed later. You had the Enlightenment philosophers, and Lewis talks about some of them, Rousseau particularly, Voltaire, and so on, who believed that they were going to exalt reason and put reason over anything related to the emotion, anything related to courage, the volition, and so on. And so let's get reason, and somehow emotion is not, you can't validate emotion. There isn't a reality that would validate emotion. So Coleridge is sentimental. If the tourists are sentimental, then what they say has no real significance. Lewis will take task that, and I'll show you in a moment. I doubt, though, he goes on to say, whether Gaius and Titius have really planned under cover of teaching English to propagate their philosophy. I think they slipped into it for the following reasons. And one of the first reasons is Lewis says that English literature is hard to do. Literary criticism is hard to do. To do literary criticism, you have to be able to understand the objectivity of the text. And if you don't understand the objectivity of the text, how then do you begin to deduce what the text says? And so he says, I think they're doing something simpler, and that is to just debunk the emotion. He goes on to say, too, in the second place, I think Gaius and Titius have honestly misunderstood the pressing educational need of the moment. They see the world around them swayed by emotional propaganda. Remember, it was during World War II. They have learned from tradition that youth is sentimental, and they conclude that the best thing they can do is fortify the minds of young people against emotion. But Lewis makes this observation. My own experience as a teacher tells an opposite tale. For every one pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, there are 3 who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. By starving the sensibility of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes. For famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. What does he mean by just sentiments? What does he mean by that we need to build in people just sentiments? Well, let's talk about this for a minute. He talks about emotional propaganda. By starving the sensibility of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes. The Green Book, again, written during World War II, when propaganda had achieved new heights, more than it had been seen before, by virtue of film media, by virtue of radio, by virtue of all kinds of things. And on the other hand, to suppress the emotions is no guarantee that we'll communicate with greater authenticity. Aristotle in his rhetoric has for something to be convincing, there has to be logos, that's the word, there has to be content, there has to be ethos, that would be the credit of the speaker, and Augustine picks up on it in his On Christian Doctrine, picks up on Aristotle, says it's not only the credibility of the speaker, but also the audience. If I'm trying to sell you hair restore, you're not going to buy it from me. I don't have credit, I'm bald. Either I don't believe in the product or I tried it and it didn't work for me. So it's the credit. So logos, content, ethos, credit. And then lastly, there's also pathos, the emotion. Pathos is a word from which we get sympathy, to be with a person in the sadness, or empathy, to actually be in the sadness because we've had similar sadness in our own life. It was Walt Disney said he never made a movie without trying to give people both laughter and a tear. He wants to speak to the emotion. If you have the emotion without credit and content, it's true, it'll drift towards propaganda. But if you have content and credit without emotion, that's boring. That's boring. And Aristotle saw you had to have all of them to be convincing. The pathos tries to move the person to action based on what they understand with their head and what they see by virtue of its authenticity. So the emotion is important. And here's Gaius and Titius who are trying to wipe it out. And Lewis makes this observation. Let me repeat, the right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. By starving the sensibility of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propagandist when he comes. For famished nature will be avenged in a hard heart. There's no infallible protection against a soft head. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. We were poor. We didn't have many toys. My dad would make toys out of things. In fact, one of the things that he did was he took that cylinder. Remember the cylinder on the inside of a toilet paper roll? And when the toilet paper was used and he had to put a new roll of toilet paper on the one little bathroom we had in our house, he would come out with the toilet paper cylinder. He called it a hoo-hoo, because whoever ended up with the hoo-hoo got to go around the house going hoo-hoo, 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 and you had license to use it. Fortunately, it was made of flimsy cardboard and it didn't last very long or you'd drive everybody nuts. But initially it was, he would come out with a hoo-hoo and he would give us a quest. You know, whoever mows the lawn first, whoever picks up their leaves first, whoever washes the car first, they get the hoo-hoo. And it was amazing what we'd do to try and get that hoo-hoo. But eventually the game degenerated to the place where whoever first discovered that the hoo-hoo was available got the hoo-hoo. Well, that led to all kinds of unscrupulous behavior, like using inordinate amounts of toilet paper, hovering around the bathroom when my sister would be in there to see if the toilet paper got used before when she was done, we'd rush in to see who could claim the hoo-hoo for themselves. Well, if you grow up with the hoo-hoo and you have your own children, you teach them about the hoo-hoo. So my kids did this. And I remember when my oldest son, Jeremy, was only 18, 20 months old, something like that. And he had already been taught about the hoo-hoo. Well, we were in this little 2-bedroom townhouse and I hadn't heard a peep from Jeremy for about 20 minutes. If you have a 18 to 20 month old and you haven't heard a peep from him in 20 minutes, something's going on. So I went looking for him. I came to the guest bathroom and right at the door, there was a pile of toilet paper. Inside the door was a discarded hoo-hoo. Next to that was a discarded spring. Remember what the spring was? It was inside the hoo-hoo holder. They would push it out so that it would hold the hoo-hoo in those little places that were inset so the hoo-hoo holder could go there. And Jeremy was preoccupied with closing the hoo-hoo holder up without the spring in it and opening it up real quick so it would go. Now, come on, tell me, did any of you ever do anything like that when you were young? I hope you all did. I hope you had the childhood where you saw that. Why does it pop? Why does it pop? Well, you create a vacuum. And when you create the vacuum and stretch out the distance of that vacuum, as soon as you open it up and break the vacuum, air rushes in and makes that pop. Now, I don't know, Ray's a physicist. Maybe he could correct my thinking on this. But anyway, there was the pop. Lewis is saying it's sort of like that. You chase out just sentiments and you make the person more susceptible to the propagandists when they come because you created a vacuum. There is no objective value and anything can rush in to fill the vacuum. You're better off creating just sentiments, helping the person, irrigating deserts, helping them to understand what is true, what is just, what is sentimentally proper. So what's a just sentiment? And I would suggest to you that there can be a place where emotional states can be in harmony with reason. If you go to a birthday party, you should be happy for the person you're celebrating. If you're on your way to the birthday party and you get a text message or a phone call that says one of your friends was hurt in an accident, well, you need to call the person and not go to the party lest you take your moroseness to that party. Call the person, say, you know what, something's come up. I'll tell you about it later. I hope you have a great party. There's a reason why I can't come, bless your heart. And you go to the hospital to be with that friend. But you don't take your moroseness to the party. It's a downer. If you go to a funeral, you go with the somberness of that occasion. There's an emotional response that's appropriate to that. Unless, of course, you owed the guy a lot of money and nobody else knew about it, then maybe you go kind of giddy or something like that. But it's not because of the funeral itself, it's because of something else. There is an emotion that's appropriate, that's just sentiment. Justice means to render to a thing its due. It's worthy of this response. So furthermore, these tourists at the waterfall were not in disagreement. Nevertheless, one had a more robust and nuanced description of the waterfall. And Lewis says that Coleridge was right to say with the one that it was sublime was the better description. Nature itself merited that response. There's a place where Lewis is writing in a personal heresy about language and the use of language to respond to certain things. And he writes this, there are two kinds of symbol that must surely be distinguished. The algebraical symbol comes naked into the world of mathematics and is clothed with value by its masters. The poetic symbol, on the other hand, like the rose for love in Guillaume de Laurier's Romance of the Rose, comes trailing clouds of glory from the real world. Clouds whose shape and color largely determine and explain its poetic use. Why does a poet use rose to describe of something? Anyway, in an equation, X and Y will do as well as A and B. But the romance of the rose could not without loss be rewritten as the romance of the onion. And if a man did not see why, we could only send them back to the real world to study roses, onions, and love, all of them still untouched by poetry, still raw. To say something meaningful, there must be a reality to support the claim. To feel something appropriately, there must be a reality that validates the sentimental response. We don't get rid of sentiment. We try to find just sentiment, ordinate sentiment. And then he gives several quotes at this point in the book. Traherne says, can you be righteous unless you render to things their due esteem? Augustine talked about ordo amoris, ordered loves. We should love God first, and then love your spouse and your children and your friends. And then as you move down the list, come down the ladder, you have your career, you have your hobbies, you have your interests, et cetera, et cetera. You love your alma mater, your school, or whatever. But ordo amoris, if I put other things before God, I'm going to have chaos. If I put God first and these other things somehow get wiped out, I'm going to make it. I'll be sad, but I'm going to make it because I have proper, just sentiments. Aristotle says the aim of education is to make the student like and dislike what he ought. Well, that would be utterly tyrannical if there wasn't actually an order in the universe, if there wasn't actually a reality that existed that should be responded to in a proper way. The pupil who has thus been trained in ordinate affections or just sentiments will easily find the first principles in ethics, but to the corrupt man, they'll never be visible at all, and he can make no progress in the science. In Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is the book most quoted by Lewis in The Abolition of Man, Aristotle says vice is unconscious of itself. If I do a bad thing, I'm at risk at trying to rationalize the bad thing if I don't repent of the bad thing I've done. C.S. Lewis put it this way in a preface to Paradise Lost: continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind. G.K. Chesterton put it this way: vice demands a sort of virginity. It rationalizes itself. It explains itself away in such a way that it leads to moral blindness. And Aristotle actually had a term for this moral blindness. He called it akrasia or akrasia. So you have the alpha negation on the word krasia. And krasia means to have command. If I lose command, if I lose moral command of my life by rationalizing my bad behavior, it's a threat to my moral life. And I can begin to rationalize objective reality, which will affect my emotional responses and it will affect my rational responses, and it will affect my volitional responses. Matter of fact, at the end of the book, C.S. Lewis writes this: for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality. And the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. As Christians, we would say also there needs to be the operation of grace, because we're all fallen and we're all at risk at rationalizing our bad behavior. Or as Paul said, we suppress the truth in our unrighteousness. If I have bad sentiments, then you could see a man goes to a bar. He's looking to pick somebody up, take them home for a one-night stand, or maybe the woman goes to the bar and hopes somebody will pay for all of her drinks and looks to take a man home for a one-night stand. Neither of them are thinking about the emotion of that other person. Neither of them are thinking about the hopes and fears or the aspirations of that other person. They're so cut off from the reality of what it is to be human and human emotion that somehow, in denying the humanity of the other person, their own humanity dies, and you have, in a sense, an example of the abolition of man. The objective reality gives credence to right action, credence to proper emotion and affection, and also volition, proper choices. So Lewis uses examples as he describes these things from Plato, from the Hinduism, from Wordsworth, from the Indian masters, the Chinese, the Jews, the Analects of Confucius. And he goes on to say this conception of objective reality in all of its forms, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian, Oriental alike, I shall henceforth refer to for brevity as the Tao. He tries to use an Eastern term, Tao, you could say Tao if you prefer, Tao. He tries to use that term to show that this is not just a Western idea. And then he goes on to say, as he defines the Tao for us, the Tao is defined as the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing we are and the kind of thing the universe is. Now, if you remember when we talked about Lewis's big ideas the first week, I defined truth to you, and I took the classical definition. A statement is true when it says what is, or what is not, is not. This is a pen, that's true because I said what is. There was a reality that supported the claim. It says what is, or what is not, and the statement is false when it says what is not, or what is not is. This is not a pen, that's false. This is an elephant, that's false. There's no reality to support the claim. And Lewis is basically saying that same thing here. The Tao is the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain things are really true and others really false, the kind of thing we are and the kind of thing the universe is. Emotions can be judged to be accurate or appropriate based on the circumstances in which we find ourselves in this emotional situation. And if we don't respond emotionally well, then in some senses we're out of joint with reality emotionally, maybe even psychologically. And because our approvals and disapprovals, Lewis writes, are thus recognitions of objective value or responses to an objective order, therefore emotional states can be in harmony with reason. When we feel liking for what ought to be, that should be ought, not out, what ought to be approved, or out of harmony with reason when we perceive that liking is due but cannot feel it. Something's wrong. Hence the educational problem, Lewis writes in this Abolition of Man, which is basically a book on educational philosophy. Hence the educational problem is wholly different according to as you stand within or without the Tao. For those within, the task is to train in the pupil those responses which are themselves appropriate, whether anyone is making them or not, and in making which the very nature of man consists. In other words, somehow, if the world is caught up in groupthink, and they're not responding to things, they're not rendering to things their due, whether rationally to think well or emotionally to feel appropriately, then in that world, we should be teaching the students to stand up well and go against the grain, go against the groupthink, to, in essence, cultivate courage. Those outside the Tao, if they're logical, must regard all sentiments as equally non-rational, as mere mist between us and the real objects. As a result, they must either decide to remove all sentiments as far as possible from the pupil's mind, or else to encourage some sentiments for reasons that have nothing to do with their intrinsic justness or ordency. Lewis sets it So he warns, if they embark on this course, the authors of the Green Book and people like them, the difference between the old and new education will be an important one. Where the old initiated, the new merely conditions. The old dealt with its pupils as grown birds deal with young birds when they teach them to fly. But the new deals with them more as a poultry keeper deals with young birds, making them thus or thus for purposes for which the birds know nothing. In a word, the old was a kind of propagation, a mentoring. And the new, by virtue, is merely propaganda. The operation of the Green Book and its kind as a Bruce may be called men without chests. So they may have reason. Their heads are no bigger than the ordinary. It's the atrophy of the chest that makes beneath that makes them seem so. They don't have just sentiments, and they've suppressed the emotion. And consequently, then their heads look big, but it's really the atrophy of the chest. I think I could give you an example, but he says, such as the tragic comedy of our situation, we continue to clamor for those very qualities we're rendering impossible. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that what our civilization needs is more drive or dynamism or self-sacrifice or creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. Many, many years ago, I was a youth pastor in Southern California. And our church planted about 7 daughter churches over the years. And in my youth group one year, half of my youth group went to one of the daughter churches. And there was a young woman who was in that youth group. I'm going to call her Sue. That wasn't her name. And she was a delightful young woman, very popular. Everybody liked her. And she went with that other group. And we would get together as the youth group that went with the other church and our youth group maybe once a quarter. We'd do a week-long summer camp up in the mountains. So I would see Sue. Most of her friends went on to college, but she didn't. She wasn't interested in liberal arts or anything like that. So she ends up going to work as a receptionist at a machine shop. And there was a machinist there, a young guy. We're going to call him Michael. That wasn't his name, but we'll call him Michael. And Sue and Michael started flirting a bit at work. And then after a while, they started, whenever the huckster truck or the catering truck would come around, they'd always go off to a little picnic bench and eat their lunch together. And then pretty soon they needed more intimate time, so they would always go to happy hour after work. And then as they became more and more intimate, they decided to go away for a weekend and spend the weekend together. Now it gets complicated. Because you see, Mike was married with 3 kids. And while this affair was going on, Sue decided she wanted more of Michael, and she got jealous of Michael going home to his wife and 3 kids. And so she gives him an ultimatum. You can come with me, or you cannot have me. And so Michael has to choose between the footloose and fancy-free life with Sue, or to go home and confess to his wife his sin and get some counseling and bear the responsibility of being a husband and father. Well, he bails. So Sue goes to the pastor of the new church they went to and asks him to marry him, and he won't touch her with a 10-foot pole. She comes back to her old youth pastor, me, and I said, you know, Sue, I've been hearing through the grapevine. Is this really what's going on? She said, yeah. I said, Sue, you need to try and fix this. You need to have Michael go back to his wife, and you need to find out what's gone wrong with you and why this would be something that you would think would be appropriate. Well, she just went on and she found somebody to marry him. I knew the guy who did the wedding, and he was a very principled guy. And while Sue was gone on her honeymoon, I called this guy and I said, were you aware this went on? He said, no, that's not the story they told me. So they had lied to him. Well, when they got back from their honeymoon, this pastor called Sue up and said, Sue, is this really what happened? And she says, yeah. So, wow, I wish I would have known about this ahead of time. I could have saved you from a lot of sadness. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I just want you to know that you've told your husband anytime he wants, he could leave you for another woman. She said, I have not. He says, oh, yeah, you have. because you said to him it was okay for him to leave his wife for you. Adulterers always expect fidelity. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. And Lewis sees problem, abolition of man. Well, chapter 2, he's trying to figure out if Gaius and Titius are still trying to make a point. Oh, Kenny, did you want to take a break for a second? I want to finish up the other 2 chapters quickly, and then I want to apply it to judgments of beauty and judgments of morality.
Yeah, I'd say go ahead and keep going, and there are a few questions, but we'll ask them at the end.
Okay, so chapter 2 is Lewis is basically saying, if Gaius and Titius are still making judgments, Coleridge had no right to make that judgment. They're making a judgment. They think their judgment's appropriate, and yet it's not objective, very self-referential. He says, why would they still be making judgments? What's going on? By what basis do they make these judgments? And he said, well, there could be pseudo-taus. Maybe they use utilitarianism, which useful becomes the supreme ideal. But then the question is, useful for who? It's usually for the bigger party, and the bigger party may be wrong. Might does not make right, and it's not substantive enough. Sometimes the lesser party may be the truer party. It could be instinct, but Lewis says our instincts say all different sorts of things. And if any given moment you've got 2 or 3 instincts calling, if there isn't some capacity to make a judgment that transcends instinct itself, you'll never make sense of the instincts at all. And then he says there could also be something else, and that could be economic value. But the economic value begins to fall hard too when we see that there are problems that could relate to that. We make an economic judgment, and maybe it ends up becoming an immoral judgment if we put people at risk and so on. So Lewis ends that chapter, the 2nd chapter, saying, perhaps it's like this, perhaps it's like that, perhaps they use this, perhaps they use that. You see the contradictions. I've got a bunch of other stuff in the notes. You could read them later. But Lewis says, I draw the following conclusions of chapter 2. This thing which I have called for convenience of Tao, which many others may call natural law or traditional morality or the first principles of practical reason or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected. If any value is retained, it is retained. The effort to refute it and raise a new system of values in its place is self-contradictory. There never has been and never will be a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world, because this value is rooted in reality as we see it, as we perceive it. We'll develop it later a little bit more. He goes on to say, though, that the Tao does admit development from within. There's a difference between a real moral advance and a mere innovation. From the Confucian, don't do to others what you would not like them to do to you, to the Christian, do as you would be done by, is a real advance. The Christian is not a contradiction of the Confucian, and anybody who sees the truth of the Confucian would see that this is a more robust development. That's fair. Both are within the Tao of objective value, the doctrine of objective value, but there's development. He says, but to deny this, it is the difference between a man who says to us, you like your vegetables moderately fresh, why not grow your own and have them perfectly fresh? And a man who says, throw away that loaf and try eating bricks and centipedes instead. Doesn't work. You can't break free of this. An open mind and questions that are not ultimate is useful. Some opinion, we talked about it the first week, opinions based on probability rather than certainty. It's therefore subject to doubt, and reasonable people could differ on matters of opinion. If I disagree with you in a matter of truth and you hold to the truth, I'm unreasonable at that point. For you to say I'm utterly unreasonable, you'd have to prove I was unreasonable at every point. Then you'd be unreasonable, see, if you didn't make that proof and made that judgment. But if I disagree with you on a matter of truth, that's unreasonable. But if I disagree with you on a matter of opinion, that's not unreasonable, because opinion is based on probability, not certainty. It's subject to doubt, and reasonable people could differ. So an open mind in questions that are not ultimate, questions of opinion, is useful. But an open mind about the ultimate foundations, either of theoretical or practical reason, is idiocy. And I'm not talking about then not recognizing that there can be development within the truth that's understood, the Tao. Any truth I know. could still be plumbed more deeply, could be applied more widely, even to questions I haven't yet asked, that could be understood in coherent relations with other truths. If a man's mind is open to something like the Tao, objective value, let his mouth at least be shut. He can say nothing to the purpose. Outside the Tao, there is no ground for criticizing either the Tao or anything else. To apply this further, we could say we should be narrow in matters of truth. We should be open in matters of opinion, and we should be wise enough to know the difference between them. In chapter 3, Lewis goes on to say, the power of man to make himself what he pleases means, as we have seen, the power of some men to make other men what they please. Stepping outside the Tao, the doctrine of objective value, they have stepped into the void. Nor are their subjects necessarily unhappy men. They're not men at all. They're just mere artifacts. The conditioners make the people to be whatever they want them to be. Man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man. I remember years ago, I saw David Brinkley on C-SPAN. Remember David Brinkley? He was back in the Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, Douglas Edwards period of newscasters, where they would give the news. They didn't make judgments about it. They just gave the news. And then we would listen to the news. I'm sure some of it was slanted one degree or another, but nothing like we see today. And then we would think about it and we'd make our own judgments, come to our own conclusions. Well, David Brinkley was given a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Broadcasters Association. And I saw his speech on C-SPAN. It was years and years ago. And he was saying, I fear that we've come to the place where the role of the media is not to report what happens, but to shape public policy. To the degree that they do that, they're conditioning us. And consequently, Lewis's book becomes extremely relevant as he drives us to the attempt to understand objective reality and not be caught up in this kind of groupthink. And his reason for presenting this is as relevant when he presented it as it is now. It's as relevant now as it was when he presented it. Stepping outside the Tao, they have stepped into the void. When all that says it is good has been debunked, what says I want remains. All judgments require a standard, and without rigorous effort to understand the reality that allows us to make a judgment that a thing is truly good, there's a standard that supports a claim, and that standard is objective, then we're reduced to self-referentialism, and I want is all that remains. And it leads to thoughtlessness. It leads to anarchy. If I can coalesce with a party that has similar sentiments to me, sentiments not necessarily rooted in reality, but rooted in a kind of groupthink, where I can dismiss somebody else with a name, an ad hominem, and so on. You know, if I call a person who voted for somebody on the left a Marxist, and I haven't read Marx, I'm not qualified to make that judgment. If I call a person a narcissist and I don't have long training in psychology, and I haven't had that person get on my couch and analyze them, I'm not qualified to call them a narcissist. If I call them a racist because they did something bad, and I haven't seen that everything that they have done has exercised racist tendencies, I could say that's a racist act, but I can't call them a racist. I don't know that. And we see this sort of thing going on in our world. The conditioners, therefore, must come to be motivated simply by their own pleasure or their own interest or their subjective projection on a culture. They lose objective reality, and if they can gain a hearing, it leads to the abolition of man, to the destruction of the culture. And Lewis goes on to say, I'm very doubtful whether history shows us one example of a man who, having stepped outside of traditional morality and attained power, has used that power benevolently. And probably one of the most powerful statements in the book is at the end when Lewis says, either we are rational spirit obliged forever to obey the absolute values of the Tao, or we are mere nature to be kneaded and cut into new shapes for the pleasures of masters who must by hypothesis have no motive but their own natural impulses. Only the Tao provides a common human law of action which can overarch rulers and ruled alike. A dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule which is not tyranny and an obedience which is not slavery. So anyway, at the end, after chapters 1, 2, and 3, Lewis applies Lewis looks at, has an appendix, and with the appendix, he looks at examples throughout history and through the literature of East and West. How do we evaluate Lewis's argument? I don't think it's an even argument myself. So Richard Weaver, who wrote the book, Ideas Have Consequences, he taught at University of Chicago, he's a rhetorician. He also wrote the book, The Ethics of Rhetoric. And he believed if you want to look at an objective approach to argumentation, the most ethical form of argumentation is the argument from definition. I define the term, and I seek to build inferentially on that sound definition, a definition that reflects reality. And now I can think, there could be development within the Tao. I can think inferentially in a proper way and come to various conclusions, applying this to various areas. That, he said, is the most ethical form of argumentation, argument from definition. It's substantive, there's something there. If I go off the rails, I can go back to the definition, and I can even trace my inferences and find out where I went off the rails, and I can fix it objectively. The second form of argument is the argument from similitude. Sometimes I can't get to definition. The word definition literally means of the finite. We define things by their limitation and their function. This is a pen. I can define it by virtue of its limitation, and it's small enough I could wrap words around it and clarify it from the paper, from the computer, from whatever. There may be some arbitrariness in calling it a pen. That's just a symbol that I apply to one of these things, and it makes it possible for me to talk about one of these things when I don't have it. The word may be arbitrary initially, but if I'm going to have a language and a culture, it can't be arbitrarily continually. I eventually have to say it's a pen, and if it's going to be for you a Gesortenblatt, and for somebody else it's going to be a Umfame, we're not going to have language. We're not going to have coherence. So I call it a pen. We settle on that for this language group called English, and we can have real conversation. So it's small enough to wrap words around it and distinguish it from other things. So, and it's also defined by its function. So if I have cutlery, the fork is something that pokes, the knife is something that slices, the spoon is something that scoops. So by finitude and function, we define a thing. How do you define God then, if he's infinite? Well, he breaks the category. So I have to use similitude. Jesus, when he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, says the kingdom of heaven is like, or he'll use a parable. He'll tell a story, and we catch on. The scholastic theologians and philosophers talked about the way of analogy to talk about the infinite, and so on. Then we have the third form of argument, which is the least ethical. And it's the argument from consequence. If you vote for my opponent in this next election, the whole country is going to go to hell in a handbasket. How do I know that? I don't. I'm trying to create an imagined consequence of what's going on. And then what I'm trying to do is create in you fear so I can manipulate you to vote for whoever I want you to vote for. And that's unconscionable. It's interesting that those three, definition is the most ethical, similitude next, consequence is the least ethical. You also can then have an argument from authority, where I don't know how to argue, so I just quote somebody else, or I produce books like the quotable C.S. Lewis or something like that. But nevertheless, definition, similitude, consequence, and authority. You can have an argument from history, but the argument from history can either be an argument like similitude, because I say, well, these situations are somewhat like what happened back in the 14th century when we saw these conditions. So it's like that. Or I could say, oh, that guy over there, he's like Hitler. And I could use the horrible nature of Hitler and just apply it. I haven't really made the segue. I haven't really built the argument. And so I just dismiss this person, say he's like Hitler, and it's an argument from consequence. Vote for that guy and the whole world's going to go to hell in a handbasket. So the argument from history is one that we have to be able to discern how is it being used. It's one thing to tell history, explain what happened. It's another thing to use history as a means to try to manipulate people or move people or get them to think about particular subjects. Sometimes history is helpful. Sometimes it's destructive, as it's used argumentatively. Okay, so in Lewis's book, he's got 4 chapters. First one is an argument from definition. Chapter 1 is by far the strongest chapter. That's why we spent so much time in it tonight. Chapter 2, you don't have a towel. What do? You may substitute with something like this. It's an argument from similitude. The last chapter, the whole society is going to go to hell in a handbasket. It's going to be the abolition of man. I don't know that that's going to happen. Who knows what might happen? Maybe there's revival. Maybe there's reformation. Maybe people come to their senses and so on. And then the last chapter, of course, quotes, appeal to authority. And I think you can see the breakdown in the book that way. And I think its strength declines as it goes along. That's my opinion as I look at the book. All right, so let's take the chapter by definition and see if we could apply it to something like beauty, When we talk about beauty, can we have objectivity in beauty? That's the question. And Lewis says yes. To have objectivity in beauty, then you've got to have the subject and you've got to have the object. And Lewis looks at the object, objective beauty, and he calls it admirable beauty. It's intrinsic to the object, whether I see it or not. I'm going to hold up something to you, and I want you immediately to answer the question, how many squares do you see there? How many squares? If you said 16, you're way off. There's 16 little ones, and there's one big one, that's 17. But then you've got squares of 4. So you have this square of 4 here. You have this square of 4 here. You have this square of 4 here. This square of 4 here. Then you have this square of 4 here in the middle, a square in the absolute middle of 4, and a square at the bottom in the middle of 4. Then you have a square over on this side of 4 and a square over here of 4. That would be 26 squares. But then you've got squares of 9. And there's 4 squares of 9 here, 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 and here. There are 30 squares there. If you looked at it first and you saw 16, those 16 were there, but it wasn't a robust enough description. You're like the guy who says it's a pretty waterfall rather than a sublime one. Consequently, because there's an objective reality to things that are beautiful, it has some substance to it, then expert opinion could be helpful. I remember one time I said to my wife, I thought Picasso was an idiot. She said, really? What do you know about Picasso? I said, I don't know very much about him at all. She says, well, then we need to renegotiate who the idiot is here, and we need to find out if that idiot is educable. She'd just taken a course on Picasso. They were having an exhibit on him at the Chicago Art Institute. We went down there on that next Saturday, and she said, I want you to see stuff. And she explains to me what's going on with Picasso. I'm going, oh my, I missed it. Years later, we were in Barcelona, Spain, and we went to the Picasso Museum, and I was just totally blown away. He's not my favorite artist, but I appreciate him deeply, and I've gotten much from him. So expert opinion, she saw there were 30 squares, and I was so arrogant, I was only going to allow 16. Expert opinion can help us if there's an objective side to beauty. But there's a subjective side too. Can the subjective side come into proper association with the object? And so consequently, Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica says, objects of beauty have integrity, proportion, and clarity. If they have those 3 qualities, they could have 330 qualities. But at least those 3 he begins with, because he abstracts from different examples of things people felt were beautiful. And he says, what are the characteristics of those things? And he began to see integrity, proportion, and clarity. You go to buy a Christmas tree, do you buy that Christmas tree? Or do you buy this Christmas tree? My guess is you buy this one. Why? Well, there's proportion there, but also it has integrity to what you have a concept of treeness is, as you abstract all the examples of trees you've seen in your life. And this one approximates more closely what that should be. But you also have proportion. Remember when you were in first grade and you had to do the book All About Me? And you drew the first picture and it was of you and you just got your head in there. I have my book still. My head is the whole page. The next page, I was supposed to draw my parents, and they each got a half page, and I had their whole body in there. And then the next page, I was supposed to draw my brothers and sisters, and they looked like little ants. And you could see how self-referential I was. Self is big, parents are okay, they got to take care of me, and then my siblings are ants. Then the teacher says, okay, you need to draw something more. And I said, well, teacher, what do I draw? She said, Jerry, there's still time in class. You need to draw something you like. So I drew an airplane. I like airplanes. I go up to her, I go, teacher, I'm done. She says, Jerry, there's still more time. Draw something else. So I went back and drew 3 airplanes. I wasn't very creative, 3 of the same thing. So then I go to her and I say, teacher, I'm done. What do I draw? She says, Jerry, there's still time. So I go back to my room at my desk and I draw time. I drew a clock. Now look at that. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you know, and then I go, uh-oh, I still got more to go over here. I didn't know how to draw a clock. I didn't know how to have proportion, 12 at the top, 6 at the bottom, 3 over here, 9 over here, and then draw the other ones in between and so on. This is a useless drawing, unless I'm Salvador Dali and I want to make a surrealistic clock out of it or something like that. It lacked proportion. But I don't want to get too crazy with this because I can do creative things with proportion. Picasso has a painting something like this. It's got proportion. It uses 3 sides of the paper, but it's just basically somebody's bottom, and it fills in gestalt all of this. And so there are creative ways that an artist can bring integrity, proportion, and clarity to the picture. One of my favorite paintings is Nude Descending a Staircase by Duchamp. It was first displayed in 1905. Some people consider it the first work of modern art. It doesn't look anything like a nude. Look it up before you go to sleep. What it looks like is descent. He's captured movement. People, the movie camera had just come out, and he took movie picture of people descending, and then he overlaid all the frames and tried to catch it in one frame. And you've got movement in this single frame. You've got movement. It has integrity, but the artist comes at it from a different angle and helps us, we who don't maybe have an artistic eye, to see things we would have missed otherwise. So there's beauty. We can make judgments about beauty. It's possible to do that, but we've got to look at what are the objective qualities in the admirable thing as we bring our subjective understanding up to play. And we have to be honest about it. Can I honestly say Prague is the most beautiful city in the world? No, because I haven't been to every city. Can I say Prague's the most beautiful city I've ever seen? I could say, yeah, but you can ask me, what have I seen? And if I say, well, I've seen Barstow, California, it's not much of a comparison. And if you're from Barstow, believe me, I'm not trying to pick on you, but I'm glad you do the work there and you refine resources and all that stuff, and it's helpful for all of us, but it's not a really beautiful place to live. If I compare Prague to Barstow, it doesn't mean much for Prague. But if I compare Prague with Cape Town, South Africa, or Reykjavik, Iceland, if I compare it to Belfast, Ireland, or Salzburg, Austria, or Vienna, Austria, or Budapest, or if I compare it to Seattle, or San Francisco, or Quebec City, all these are places where I've been. Quito, Ecuador. My word, if now I say Prague's the most beautiful city I've ever seen, it has merit, but what do I have to be able to do? I have to be able to give you a definition for beauty, and I have to be able to apply it to a city. And if I can't give you the definition that would include integrity, proportion, and clarity, and apply it to a city like Prague, built around, on hillsides, around the Moldau that snakes through there, and you see the integrity, the clarity, the proportion. You see 1,000 years of architecture in that one city. It's a magnificent city. Now I can make a judgment and I can validate the judgment. Otherwise, I've just got to be reduced to saying I like Prague. That's okay, as long as I'm not trying to coerce other people to that. And I've lost out on the Tao, the doctrine of objective value in the process. How about morality? How about morality? If you go to the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle makes this objective judgment about the world that we live in. And he says, this objective world is such that most people seek to live life towards an end. We're moving, we're developing. What's the end to which we move towards? And he said he thought it was the happy life, the good life. But how do we judge a happy life? Not circumstantially. You can't judge a happy life any more than you could judge that it was a good football game after the first 5 minutes of play. Or it was a good baseball game after the first inning. You can't judge if a life was a good life or a happy life till towards the end, because we have our bumps and bruises and we're developing and we're awkward and we're moving. But the good life is a life when all my basic needs are met. All my basic needs are met. What determines what my basic needs are? My nature. My nature. And so I'm dealing with reality, how I'm hardwired and so on. And I have biological needs: food, sleep, drink, shelter. I have sociological needs to live in a society that has order, that has a political stability and so on. And political needs. I am a political person by nature. Why? Because I'm a social person. The fact that I have the capacity to communicate seems to indicate that I am made for community. And those communities need to be ordered. If I'm a sociological being, then I'm also a political being. I want a society that has order and peace and these sorts of things. And also I have intellectual needs. The mind craves ideas like the stomach craves food. I have soulish needs: to be educated, to be exposed to beauty, to grow in my understanding of beauty. If I don't, then I'm living a truncated life. It's not as good as it could be. And it's not as happy a life. But if my nature determines what I need, then I ought to desire what I need. But when I want more than I need, it prevents me from living the good life. If I want more food than I need, I can become obese. If I want more sleep than I need, I become lazy. If I work harder than I need to work so that I neglect my family, I lose the sociological domestic peace. And so consequently, I know what's good for you because I know what's good for me. And I want to live in a society that's just and equal opportunity, not equity per se, but equal opportunity for everybody. And if there's an injustice and you can't have an equal opportunity, then I'm not living in a good life because my society's messed up. It's not politically balanced. And I need to fight to help you gain justice in that society. And so we get down to these characteristics then. If I want more than I need, Aristotle says we need to find the golden mean. And the mean between cowardice and foolhardiness was courage. The need between excess and utter denial was temperance. And then we've got wisdom, and we also have justice. And these were the characteristics of virtue that allowed me to live the good life. They were the means of good life. If you see a person who's eating too much, or you see a person who's disrespectful of a just society, you can say to them, you shouldn't live like that. And that judgment is validated by the objective reality that supports the claim. And anyway, that all comes from the Abolition of Man. And I think that that's probably it, Kenny. Maybe we have questions.
Great, Jerry. Thank you so much. That was awesome. Hey, a couple questions. And I'll just remind people, if you have a question, text me at, I'll give you my number here, 619-508-3785. And so if you want to text me, but here's the first question. It's kind of a two-part question. So one of the quotes that you gave early on was, the task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. Can you?
Good job. They did a good job highlighting the question.
Yeah, can you comment on that?
It's in your notes. It's in your notes.
That's where I think they got it from.
The context is that Lewis saw in Gaius and Titius that they were concerned that youth was sentimental, and therefore they needed to cut down jungles because the sentiments could cause the people to go into all kinds of irresponsible expressions. And Lewis says that hasn't been my experience at all. I found instead that there's more cold vulgarity than there is inappropriate sentiment. But the goal is to inculcate just sentiments and to help the student like what is ordinate, what is appropriate, given the objective reality that's out there. It's okay if you are finding yourself coming into that place in adolescence and post-adolescence where you're falling in love. That's okay. What's not okay, though, as those sentiments are growing, is to express those sentiments in an inappropriate way where you're disrespectful of another person and you take advantage of them, sexually, say, or something like this. So consequently, we have to build into them a sense of objective reality. If it's not good for you to take advantage of me, then it's not good for me to take advantage of somebody else. I remember when I was in college and graduated, a bunch of my guy friends that I played football with, we had daughters. And we started talking about what we were going to do when the guys come to date our daughters. You know, one of them said he was going to be cleaning a shotgun when the guy comes by, you know, and I was going to be out in the weight room, bench pressing 400 pounds when he came by, and then squeeze his hand, you know, and say, enjoy your date with my daughter, but get her back before the street lights go on. And I'd make sure it was in the winter when the street lights went on at 5 o'clock. Why do we do this? If it was inappropriate for us to take advantage of somebody else's daughter, if it's inappropriate for somebody to take advantage of our daughter, then it's inappropriate for us to take advantage of somebody else's daughter. That's objective reality. And it's good for me and it's good for you. That's just. And consequently, Lewis says we have to irrigate deserts because people don't see this. They're so self-referential and they don't see the wider world, and they're not learning to flourish in that world. And they're not able to live the good life either because they're morally compromised and so on. God help us. So I think that's what it means. I think that's what Lewis is saying.
So the next part of the question is, what do you think Lewis would say about modern education if he were alive today?
I think he would say the same thing he already said. I think he would refer us to the abolition of man. I don't think the challenges have evaporated compared to Lewis's day. If anything, I think that they have become exasperated. It's bigger. This subjectivism seed is bearing its fruit in our culture, and it's kind of exhibiting itself as anarchy. Fortunately, the culture is surviving, and I think it's surviving because of the economics. I think businesses are keeping things afloat where the government's kind of goofy. We can't do some of the things that the government's doing, and I don't understand some of those things. I'm trying to figure it out, and maybe I'm just missing it, you know. But it seems to me that the society seems to be holding together because businessmen want to still make their money, and people still need jobs. And so right now we seem to be holding together. We don't have complete anarchy. Although we do have cities burning down, don't we? It's just goofy. And I think Lewis would say education needs to be teaching kids objective reality so they can begin to understand their place in the world better, and not I don't know. I read the Communist Manifesto every 3 years just to see where the culture is going. And basically the Communist Manifesto, Marx is developing his ideas out of Hegel, who believed in the dialectic. You know, you have the thesis, antithesis, it resolves itself in synthesis. That becomes a new thesis, has its antithesis, resolves itself in synthesis, and everything's sort of moving onward and upward. Hegel had a theory of history, and he thought things were moving onward and upward, but he was a pantheist. He believes that it was a spirit guiding him. Well, Marx believed it was guided by class struggle, and these things have to be resolved. Well, why would I stop at communism if I get to the top of the food chain? And Marx says because we would eliminate opposition. We just eliminate people. And Marx thinks that what he's going to do is going to be good for the proletariat, the underclass, and so on. History's shown that it hasn't worked out quite that way. I think he had an inflated view of human nature. And consequently, things went awry and went really bad. But how do you create the revolution that brings about communism? Class conflict, get people to be mad at each other. They don't talk to each other. We don't engage in the kind of debates that Lewis did with EMW at Tilliard in the personal heresy. We instead are dismissive of the other person. We use informal fallacies like begging the question. If this is what my group thinks, we don't have to prove it to you. This is what we think. And so therefore we've begged the question of how we arrived at this conclusion. We've we've begged the question of thesis development to get to this conclusion. We just expect you to believe it. And if you don't believe it, we just dismiss you. This is terrible. And I think Lewis anticipates a lot of this in the Abolition of Man. You can see he writes about it in novel form, which I think his novel, That Hideous Strength, which is a novel he wrote to be a complement to the Abolition of Man. The novel does a better job than chapter 3 of the Abolition of Man, because now he's just imaginatively depicting it, and he's not making the judgments that he's making in chapter 3 of the Abolition of Man, where he says, a society that rejects the Tao, this is what's going to happen. It might happen, but again, there might be people get beat up a little bit, and they say, we gotta think this through better, and they come back to objective reality, and they're restored. History has examples of cultures getting back on the rails after going off the rails for a time. So anyway,
Yeah. So here's another question. Are there examples of men without chests today that you can give us?
well, yeah, I give you one. I mentioned that woman, Sue and Mike. So she denied the sentiment. She expressed her sentiment in some ways. She thought she was doing the right thing, scheming to get this guy. But the interesting thing was she denied the sentiment of his wife. She denied the sentiment of his children. She had an atrophy of her human emotional capacities, and they atrophied, and consequently, she wasn't able to live an objective emotional life because she saw her desire trumped anybody else's desire who was involved in that picture. And in some senses, Mike did the same thing. His sexual interests in Sue trumped his desire to conjugal fidelity to his wife and parental responsibility for his children. The chest atrophied, and their rationalizing made them look like they had a good mind, but in fact it was truth rationalized. They could justify what they were doing. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
yeah, it's great. So another question was, and I know that you've been to the Eagle and a Child. So what was it? How would you describe that that pub where Lewis hung out a lot?
that's what they want to know. How would I
Yeah.
describe?
Yeah. The question is, have you ever hoisted a pint at the Eagle and the Child, or as some wag called it, the Bird and the Babe?
Yeah, many times actually. Actually, I had dinner one night with Tolkien's oldest son, John, and then he and I went and had a beer there later after he spoke at the C.S. Lewis Society in Oxford.
Wow.
Just the two of us. Um, the pub life in England is different. It's complex. I kind of like it. Usually, if you're going to meet with somebody, you don't meet with them at your house. You meet with them at the local living room, which is the local pub. Now, if you're in a college community, some of those pubs will take on the characteristic of college students, and they could get a bit raucous. When I used to live in Oxford, the Eagle and Child was a pub where mostly academics hung out. So it's kind of quiet. The music in the background was classical music. That's changed now. They've got video games there and stuff. It's kind of dumbed down a little bit. Somebody told me they're going to build a kind of a hotel over the top. So they'll keep the facade, and they're compromising it. It's terrible. But there was a pub. There was an Oxford taxi driver who was a friend of mine, and he knew more of the geography of C.S. Lewis's life than anybody in the world. As a matter of fact, one time he mapped it all out, and we went and saw all the places where Lewis fought in World War I. He knew all that stuff, everything. He knew where all the Inklings were buried. You could do Oxford in a half a day with him, what it would take you 6 months to find if you were on your own. And he hung out at this pub called the Cricketer's Arms. It was on Iffley Road. It was all taxi drivers and lorry drivers. It had its own personality. And then there were some other ones. There was the Oxford Blue, which was all Oxford Brookes students. They hung out there. The Oxford University students, they were at different pubs closer to the university for them. There was one called the Bear. It's one of the oldest pubs in Oxford, and it was more businessmen in Oxford and so on. So they all kind of take on a different characteristic, and it's kind of fun. You could write a doctoral dissertation on the sociological subcultures of the pubs of Oxford.
Like the cafes of Paris.
Say it again.
It's like the cafes of Paris.
Yeah, very much. You showed me that before.
Yeah.
Were there 12,000 cafes in
Yeah,
Paris?
a lot.
Yeah.
A lot.
Because of the Du Magot, which is the
That's right.
child of cafes in Paris.
That's right. Yeah. So next week is the Great Divorce. What would you say to someone to maybe motivate them to read that book for next week?
It's very short. Very short. You could read it in an evening. You could read it in 2.5, 3 hours. So even if you read a half hour a night, but every night between now and next week, you'd have it down. It's also a delightful book. Sometimes if somebody says, I want to read Lewis, what would you advise? I usually ask, do you like fiction or nonfiction? And then I advise them based on what they would like in the area of fiction or what they would like maybe in the area of nonfiction. But they say, well, I kind of like them both. I don't know. What would you advise? I usually say, go The Great Divorce. It's a great introduction to Lewis. You get some of his imaginative thought. You get some of his theological thinking. You don't want to press some of his theological, you don't want to press the theology too rigidly, because sometimes an author will take liberties with their fiction that they wouldn't take when they're writing more precisely. Okay. But Lewis does a delightful job, and it's a satirical restatement of Dante's Divine Comedy, if I could put it that way.
Good. I think we have time for one more question. Another question came through, so I'll just read it as it came through. So for Christians today, what would C.S. Lewis recommend for living in a way in our culture that we strike a balance between loving our neighbor while standing in objective truth, kind of being as shrewd as a serpent and at the same time as innocent as doves in the main kind of ways of life as we live our lives?
Well, loving your neighbor and objective truth should not be in conflict. As a matter of fact, they should be in balance. Lest I say I'm loving my neighbor and I'm really condoning bad behavior, or lest I say I'm speaking the truth and I'm being obnoxious towards my neighbor. How do I bring balance? And there's an informal fallacy. I think I talked about the informal fallacies last time you asked me to send you one. Somebody asked for them.
Yeah.
There's about 15. There's more than 15, but I got a chart of 15. If somebody wants one, you could talk to Kenny and he'll send it out to you, because I already sent him. But there's a bunch of them. The ad hominem, call the person a name, the straw man argument, you misrepresent the other person's position and then you dismantle it because you represented it in a way that's easily dismantleable. You've got the false analogy. You've got the simplified argument. You make something an either or. If you stop beating your wife yet, no matter how you answer that, you're in trouble. But it hasn't been a proper question, because the answer is going to not allow you for a proper. The question's not going to allow a proper answer. You got the begging the question, where you assume the outcome before you do this, before you've made the argument. You've got the hypothesis contrary to fact. There's a whole bunch of them. But the one that I see in the area of loving neighbor and truth that's most violated in my experience is what we call the ad misericordiam argument. The argument from the miserable heart. So if we know from reading scripture, and we believe the Bible's an objective book, and we believe it's a revealed book, so that behind it there's omniscience, and that what it tells us is beyond our capacity to invent. This is not just subjectivism. It is objective reality rooted in the very character and nature of God. And if it tells us abortion's wrong, or if it tells us same-sex marriage is wrong, or same-sex attraction is wrong, and a person says in response to that, yeah, but I have a friend. So they have a friend who's had an abortion, or they have a friend who is flirting with same-sex attraction. I say immediately to that person, you know what? I applaud you for your sensitivity towards your friend. You should be sensitive towards your friend. But I'm not convinced your sensitivity towards your friend is treating your friend well. Because if you have thought that your love for your friend is okay when it's not balanced by truth, your love has left them in a perilous position because they're living contrary to God's word. So how do you do this? Or if you see a person who's just trashing another person because they had an abortion, or trashing another person because of same-sex attraction, you say, I don't know if you're helping them because you may have a standard that's fair, but I think your rigidity is not going to help that other person get to that standard. So how do you do it? Well, you look at Jesus. So in John 8, you've got the woman who was caught in adultery, and she's brought and thrown down in front of him. And they said, Moses commanded us to stone such a one. What do you say? Well, the irony is these guys caught her in the very act. Where's the man then? How come they didn't bring the man too? There's just hypocrisy all around in this thing. And did they catch her by entrapping her? We don't know the details of the story. But what we do know is they threw her down in front of Jesus, and Jesus says to these people, let him who's without sin cast the first stone. And they start peeling off. And finally, Jesus is left alone with the woman. And he says to her, did no one condemn you? And she says, no one, Lord. And he says to her, neither do I condemn you. Go your way and sin no more. He loves her, but he doesn't compromise the standard. He models for us how it should be. We should care for the person who's caught in the vortex of some struggle. We may not be able to explain why they are, but you get these people now that are wanting to have genital realignment surgery. A genital realignment surgery can't change your XXXY chromosome any more than a woman could change her age by having a facelift. And so consequently, read the studies coming out of Johns Hopkins, and we see people who are moving in that direction, and they're depressed. In Sweden, they did studies of this stuff. 20% of them committed suicide. I can say, but I have a friend, but I'm leaving them in the peril of the circumstances of a life devoid of truth, which leads to all kinds of consequences. And it's sad. It's sad. And I think I'm doing a good thing for that person, and I might not be helping them. Another example of how to answer it, you go to Ephesians 5, and it says that we should walk as children of God, beloved children of God. How do we do that? Walk in love. But right after it says walk in love, it talks about all the bad things that could happen if love is not balanced by truth, the immorality that can enter into, and this sort of thing, the excesses and so on. So then you get down to about verses 7 and 8, and it says walk in the light. That's the walk of truth. So you got to have the balance between love and truth. How do we do it? Ephesians 5:15, it says, be careful how you walk. The Greek word for careful there is akribos, from which we get the word acrobat. This is a balancing act. How do we do it? Ephesians 5:18, do not get drunk with wine, that's dissipation. Be filled with the Spirit. Realize you're not going to do well if you're not resourced by the Holy Spirit. Be filled with the Spirit. It's a weird command. It's a present, passive imperative. Present, ongoing, imperative, but you're to obey it passively. How do you do that? Let it be done to me. If we're walking in the Christian life and we're not full of the Spirit, we're probably going to mess up this balance between loving the person that we have as a friend who's caught in the vortex and speaking the truth. And we need to be filled with the Spirit in order to do that. And by the way, the sword of the Spirit's a word of God. If you're giving advice to your friends and you think you're filled with the Spirit and you're not giving them advice that's rooted in Scripture, then my guess is you're really not helping that person. That's what I'd say.
Great, Jerry. Hey, well, thank you so much. I know that if we were to say, let's everyone thank Jerry, there'd be a great round of applause and people thanking you. So thank you so much for the time tonight. And we'll sure look forward to the last time together next week from tonight on The Great Divorce.
I don't mind staying on a little bit if somebody has an immediate question.
Okay, well, we can do that. Yeah. If you guys have a question, you want to stick around for a little bit, we can do that. You can unmute yourself and put the video on and hang out for a little bit.
Go, but if they want to stay,
yeah.
It's just one man's position, opinion. Like I said at the beginning, take the crumbs, Lord, and somehow let your Holy Spirit distribute them in a way that might be encouraging to people.
So Jerry,
Yeah, Ray,
Ray,
can't see your face.
I'll
You guys
put me
can,
on
you can
here.
undo the video. There you go. There's Ray.
Okay, let me see. I have too many cameras here. I'm a professional Zoomer. But anyway, how would linguistic analysis of Wittgenstein and those German guys, did that precede the Green Book and what was happening in England? Was it their conclusions that were really driving it?
Well, that stuff's all emerging at the same time. And so Lewis was concerned about some of that stuff, and some of the Oxford Socratic Club, they had debates that way. But Lewis is still trying to get back to objectivity with them as well. An interesting thing about Wittgenstein, since you asked about him, Elizabeth Anscombe was the one who had the debate with Lewis on February 2nd, 1948. Some of these biographers said that she wiped the floor with them and all this other stuff. And even somebody like George Scher, who was a friend of Lewis's, who wrote the book Jack, a biography on Lewis, he said that Lewis said to him 2 weeks afterwards, she destroyed all my arguments for God's existence. Well, that's a bunch of nonsense, because you can read Anscombe's debate, her paper, and she published it, and they don't even talk about any arguments for existence of God. Anscombe herself was a Christian, and Anscombe instead is talking about can a subjectivist make a valid argument, or not a subjectivist, a materialist. Can a materialist make a valid argument? And Lewis said, not fundamentally based on their presuppositions. And Anscombe's not disagreeing with him about the fundamentalist presuppositions of the materialists. She's disagreeing with him that a materialist can still make a valid argument. They could argue about some topic over here, set a good definition, and argue. They were like meeting like this in the debate. They weren't even talking about God's existence. And my doctoral supervisor was there at the debate. And he was the vice president of Socratic Club. Basil Mitchell is a philosopher at Oxford. And he became the president of the Oxford Socratic Club when Lewis went to Cambridge. And he said they restaged the debate, and that he felt that John Lucas, the Oxford philosopher who took Lewis's position, defeated Anscombe at that debate. It's immaterial. Lucas would have filtered Lewis's arguments through his own thinking, and it wouldn't have been a perfect example. But nevertheless, I tell you this because Wittgenstein, Anscombe was a disciple of Wittgenstein. And if you go to Cambridge and you go from the town of Cambridge to Girton College and follow along that road, halfway there, you'll see a cemetery on your left, and you go there and all these Cambridge notables are buried there. And there's Wittgenstein's grave. And who's buried right next to him? Elizabeth Anscombe.
Wow.
And Elizabeth Anscombe was by his bedside the whole time he was dying. And she said to him, can't I call a priest for you? Can't you give confession? Confess your sins. Won't you set your heart right before God before you die? And Wittgenstein became a Christian at the end of his life.
Wow.
Through Anscombe's influence.
She was Catholic, right?
Beg your pardon?
She was Catholic, right?
Yeah, but she had the atonement right.
Okay.
She had the atonement right. So anyway, Wittgenstein is playing with these ideas. When they're not robust enough again, he moves away from them at the end of his life too. But the guy who actually brought an end to a lot of that stuff, especially some of the language game things, that if you can't demonstrate something empirically, it's not verifiable.
Phenomenal.
Huh?
Phenomenalism.
Yeah. But the guy who brought an end to it in some ways was also Basil Mitchell, because the argument, unless I can perceive it empirically, I won't believe it, is itself, if you're operating on that principle, it's not an empirically verifiable principle. And so it fell apart. And I think Wittgenstein saw some of that himself and moved away from it at the end. And he's making some pretty interesting pronouncements at the end of his life and some of the things he's writing. I'm not sophisticated enough. I'm not a scholar of Wittgenstein. I've read some of the stuff, and I've certainly read some of Anscombe, because you need to read her if you're studying Lewis. But anyway, I don't think I could give you any more answer.
Thanks. Thanks.
It's great, Ray. Thank you. Any other questions or any other thoughts?
It's good to see you, Ray. You never change. Your appearance always stays the same. Are you still professoring?
No, I'm retired, but I do docenting through the San Diego Museum of Art.
I see.
So I teach art, sort of. Yeah, so it's fun.
Well, you're a good artist.
If you're still on, you can put your video on so Jerry can see you. He wants to see who's on, so feel free to put your video on. All right. Well, Jerry, thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us and being with us. It was really great.
Thanks, Kenny. Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. We'll see you all next Tuesday night.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Jerry.
Bye-bye.
Oh, there's somebody that appeared.
Did somebody else have a question?
Yeah. Some 70 years ago, I was a sophomore in college.
This is Lloyd.
Yeah.
Can you put your video on?
I'm trying to fiddle with it. I don't know how to put the video on.
If you go to the bottom of your screen, bring your cursor to the bottom of your screen and go to the far left, you'll see a camera over there.
Yeah, okay.
Click on the camera.
There. No, it's still crossed out. There.
Oh, you're on.
Okay. Like
So,
I said, some
Jerry-
70 years ago, I was a sophomore in college. And one of the first courses I took was the interpretation of poetry. And one of the books we had during that semester, that's where I was introduced to Lewis. It was Spirits in Bondage.
Yeah.
And the more we got into it, as I recall, and of course at 92, my memory is fading a little bit, but as we got into it and discussed it, it was determined that he was anti-war. Is this correct?
I don't think so. He writes, that's the first book he published. It came out in 1919.
Right.
And he was actually considered one of the war poets, World War I poets, because of that, you know, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred
Right.
and John McCrae and so on. But there's a lot of war experiences that are expressed in that poetry. Later, he'll become a Christian and he writes an essay, Why I Am Not a Pacifist.
Oh, okay.
So he was pretty clear about that. I think he was able to see how wars often have nonsense attached to them.
Yeah.
But
Being the son of a World War I veteran, I heard a lot about it. And the professor who was teaching this was in the Fighting 69th from New York.
well,
And they spoke a lot about it. And he had a spot in his heart for Lewis's poetry at that time.
yeah, he was way ahead of his time. Then people don't read that book very often. I'm surprised.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
interesting.
this was clear back in 1951. So
Do you still have a copy of the book?
no, I don't. I wish I did.
Yeah, it'd probably be worth thousands of dollars now.
I got rid of all my books when I left college. So not all of them, but quite a few of them.
If you have a copy of Spirits in Bondage in first edition, you could probably put a down payment on a house.
Oh, really? Well, that'd be great.
But
I'll go through the library again and look.
well, another thing too is that there was a comment that Lewis said related to just war theory, and he said, if war is ever just, then sometimes peace must be sinful.
Okay.
And so you begin with the consequent if, and then you come up with the conclusion then. So if it's ever just, so let's say somebody attacks you, you have a right to defend your sovereign state or whatever the case might be. And if we would say that it's just, then to not defend would be sinful. So I'm a Quaker. That's my background. I'm an evangelical Quaker.
Mhm.
Many Quakers are pacifists. And there was a father and son that were in the church where I became a Christian and later went on staff at that church. The father was a pacifist, and the son, I don't know if he had deep convictions one way or another, but the son was living up at Mount Shasta,
Hmm.
small little place.
Right.
The dad and mom were visiting him, and crooks broke into their house, threatened to rape the young man's wife, and also threatened to rob him. And the young man goes to defend his wife, and these two crooks are beating the stuffings out of the young man, and the father wouldn't lift a hand to help his son.
Oh,
So the son gets so angry at the father, he just goes into a rage and beats the stuffings out of the two crooks, apprehends them, calls the police, and doesn't talk to his father for the next 10 years.
oh my.
Was the father right in doing what he did?
Yeah.
If a battle is ever just, then sometimes peace is sinful.
Right.
He should have helped his son.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Very good.
So I don't know if that helps you or not.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it does.
You go look in your library. If you find that book, I'll buy it from you.
Okay. I'll do that.
But I'll buy it from you for pennies on the dollar.
Okay. I'll look in there. Thanks a lot, Jerry.
All right, blessings on you, Lloyd.
Blessings on you too.
You should grow a white beard. You'd be really handsome.
Yeah, my wife doesn't like beards.
Yeah.
I grew a mustache and a beard at one time after being out to sea for about 3 months, and she did. I had to shave it off immediately when I got back.
Were you in the Navy?
No, I worked for NOAA. I was fishery biologist
Uh-huh.
for NOAA.
Wow. That's impressive, actually.
He was also a Shakespearean actor.
Really?
Yes, it was. That was my early years.
And he read Spirits and Bondage in college. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. I was Shakespeare was, of course, my favorite.
Where did you go to school?
San Diego State.
Did you? Yeah.
San Diego State University now was a college then.
Well, they used to have a Shakespeare theater and
That's where I was at the Old Globe.
yeah.
That's where I was. Did
Wow.
Hamlet, did As You Like It, All's Well That Ends Well.
What characters did you play in each of those plays?
Minor roles, and then I did in Hamlet. I was Laertes.
Uh-huh. Laertes, yeah.
Oh,
So you forgive him at the end.
yeah. So, but not the other ones. I did myriad plays, but then I had to go to work for a living.
Yeah. Did you learn how to sword fight pretty well?
Moderately so. Yeah, moderately so. I took fencing in college, and so that's where I learned it.
Wow. Does I see Joyce on here too?
Yes, Joyce, are you still on? Can you show yourself?
Yeah, show me your face, Joyce. I take encouragement every time I see her smiling face. Maybe she's gone.
I don't know if she, yeah.
Other thing Kenny didn't mention was at age 90, I skydived.
You did?
Oh, I forgot
Yeah.
about that.
I've gone skydiving too. It's a thrill, isn't it?
Oh my, there's no thrill like it, really.
I know. Where did you go from? There's a place, Temecula. There's a place near Temecula.
No, this was at Lower Otay Lake down here in San Diego, down by the border.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you come out of the plane and you just tumble twice and come down and then glide without the chute opening, you put your arms out, and the wind's going by, you can't hear anything. And
Yeah, it's real loud.
real loud.
Then it goes to immediate peace.
When the chute opens, that's really something else. You just can see all the way around, all over the place.
We did free fall for over a mile.
Oh yeah,
It was unbelievable.
yeah.
Brian, I don't know if you can show yourself or Charles. They have both asked questions. Brian is the one you sent the other stuff to, Jerry. And
yeah,
Charles asked a question. I don't know if you guys can show your video, show yourself, start your video.
The
Oh,
informal
there we go.
fallacy
There's
stuff.
Brian.
You got this, the list of informal fallacies, Brian? Oh, your sound's not
Yeah,
on.
Brian, you're on mute.
There you go.
Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, so I mean, I can't formulate the question terribly well, but you know, some of the Lewis reading that I've done, I've gotten the sense that he focuses on the words, like this word means this, and then he kind of pulls a philosophical meaning from it. And I think about it, and if I were trying to argue it with a particular buddy of mine, I think he would, you know, say, oh, well, that's just, you know, kind of happenstance that the word happens to mean that. I'll be honest, I hadn't prepared the question. So it's just this like sense that I've gotten from reading some of his works, but I can't even think of a particular one. But does the question make any sense to you? And
In academic writing, you want to define your terms. And you take a word like freedom. Mortimer Adler, the philosopher, wrote a 2-volume work on the idea of freedom. Each book is 500 pages, so 1,000 pages on freedom. And he basically distills down 4 general uses of the word. One is just the ability to choose. If I chose this, I could have chosen something else. And he calls this natural freedom. The other one is acquired freedom, and it's the ability to choose well. The first one, natural freedom, it's benefited by a multiplicity of choices. But it's ironic in that I can have 1,000 choices and may think I'm more free because I have 1,000 choices, but they don't do me a lick of good until I make a choice. But once I make a choice, I make it at the peril of the other 999. So there's something paradoxical about natural freedom. But acquired freedom, I may not have many options, but it's the kind of freedom that Jesus is talking about in John 8, where he says, you should know the truth and the truth will make you free. So acquired freedom is informed by wisdom and truth and understanding of truth. Then you have circumstantial freedom, which is the absence of coercion, the absence of duress, the absence of restraint, and the presence of enabling means. I may want to take a trip around the world, but if I don't have the enabling means to do that, I'm not really technically circumstantially free to do that. And then you have another freedom, which is kind of a circumstantial freedom, but it looms so large, he gives it its own category. It's political freedom. And it's the ability, if I pay a fee and learn how to drive, I can then get a driver's license and I'm free to drive on the road and so on. And you can have even discussion about more freedom than is just, and that would be a perversion of freedom. That would be a license. Okay, so if I'm writing a philosophical paper and I'm using freedom, and then I'm using it this way for a minute, and then I'm using it this other way for a minute, this other way, the whole argument's going to be full of confusion because there's so much equivocation, and I haven't been coherent and consistent in how I use the word. So when you're writing philosophical work, you define the term the way you're going to use it. And there can be even some arbitrariness in how you use a term based on how somebody else might use a term. But when you define it this way and you use it consistently that way in your paper, then that's fair. That's fair game. But you have to be consistent so you avoid equivocation, because equivocation just melts down any kind of argument into nonsense. So I don't know if that's helpful to you or not.
yeah, thanks for that and for everything so far.
Yeah, the terms are important that we have them clear when we do this kind of work. So there you go.
Thank you, Brian. Jerry, thank you very much. I think we'll just go ahead and call it here, but
Okay.
excellent. Sleep
Tell
well.
Joyce I miss seeing her. Joyce, I wish you would have
I know.
on your screen, but anyway, I greet you. I pray for you every day.
All right. Love
Thank you.
Jerry. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.